Yeah. Buenos días, amigos y amigas. Es estupendo estar aquí en esta mañana y el sol brillando en los cielos. Me llamo Declan, estoy trabajando en el Departamento de Educación en esta universidad. Estudié química y física en esta universidad, maestro de los rayos X-rays cristalográfica, y estudié en la Universidad de York en Inglaterra, maestro en educación y PhD en educación. Y en esta universidad estoy trabajando con los estudiantes que enseñando en la escuela secundaria. Estudié el español cuando era en la escuela en mi ciudad de Cork. Es lengua magnífica. Lo siento mucho que lo olvido todo. Tengo pocas palabras. Es maravilloso estar aquí con los amigos de El Salvador y de Guatemala. Y bienvenidos. Gracias. I wish I could teach all of this in Spanish, but unfortunately my Spanish is not good enough. But it is nice to go to Central America and South America. And I have been in Chile 3 times to give courses to the professors in the university. And last December, I was in Costa Rica to give a seminar to the professors from the universities in Costa Rica. And in July, I will travel to Guatemala, Nicaragua. Yes, in July I go to Nicaragua to give training also in the whole area of learning outcomes. So, what I'm going to do in my first presentation is have a look at why have learning outcomes become the international language, el idioma internacional en el mundo de educación. So, what I want to do firstly is we look at why we are even discussing learning outcomes. Then we will look at what exactly is a learning outcomes framework all about. And then we will have a study of how can we provide evidence that we have constructed our programs in our university within this learning outcomes framework. So let us begin. The first thing we ask ourselves is, what are learning outcomes all about? Now, I will leave my 3 presentations on the computer. So if you wish to take them away on your USB, no es problema. Okay? Right. Now, if we look at the definitions of learning outcomes, we will see they are statements of what students should know and be able to do as a result of learning. If we look at other ones, Jenkins and Unwin in England again emphasize this word do. And in fact, if we look at various definitions of learning outcomes, they are all more or less saying the same thing. So a good working definition of a learning outcome is that it is a statement, a sentence, a simple sentence of what a student should know, understand, and be able to demonstrate or do when they have completed a process of learning. It could be one lecture, it could be a short course, a module, or it could be an entire program. in this university, we have to write learning outcomes for our short courses and for our entire programs. And this morning, I will show you how we do these here in this university. So, what is important is that learning outcomes are not something theoretical. What is important is that the learning outcomes are linked to teaching and learning and also linked to assessment. So learning outcomes framework involves linking together the learning outcomes, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment. And it is very important when we write learning outcomes that we describe them simply so that everybody understands them, and also that we describe them clearly. And for every learning outcome that we write, we should have one question in the back of our mind. How am I going to assess this learning outcome? How am I going to assess this learning outcome? Right, so the first thing I want to make clear is what do we mean by the words aims and objectives, and how do these differ from learning outcomes? The first thing about the aim is that it's an overall broad statement to give the student and your colleagues an indication of what you intend covering. So, if I was teaching a course in chemistry, the aim of this module might be to give students an introduction to organic chemistry, for example. In some countries, like in the United States, the word aim is also called a goal. They both mean exactly the same thing. Now, the objective of a module or lecture is more specific. It gives more detail than an aim. So, for example, whereas an aim might be long-term, an objective is much shorter. So when I am traveling to Nicaragua, my aim is to travel from Cork to Managua. But my first objective is to travel from Cork to Amsterdam. My second objective is to travel from Amsterdam to Panama. And my third objective is to travel from Panama to Managua. So objectives are more short-term. Now, every time we write objectives, we must, of course, also think about how we are going to assess the objectives. If we look at examples of objectives, there are certain phrases which we always use for writing aims and objectives, to give students an appreciation of something, to give them an understanding of something, to make sure they know something, to make students familiar with. So, generally speaking, therefore, aims are long-term, objectives are more specific. Now, so whenever we're writing aims and objectives, those are the key phrases that we should be using. That is the language of aims and objectives. Now, these are examples of aims. Give students an introduction, give them an understanding, give them an appreciation, help them develop knowledge and skills, provide them with an opportunity, help them to develop certain skills, for examples. Now, aims and objectives belong to the teacher-centered approach. It is the teacher, the professor, who decides on the aims and objectives of the course that you are teaching. So, when writing aims and objectives, we use words like know, understand and be familiar with. However, when we write learning outcomes, we are focusing on the student. This is commonly called the student-centered approach to teaching and learning. So when we write learning outcomes, we are writing down what we expect the student to be capable of doing. And whenever we write learning outcomes, we must always use active verbs. That is the most important sentence I am saying today. Whenever we write learning outcomes, we must always use active verbs. That is, verbs in which the students do something. So they might be able to define something, or list something, or analyze something, or calculate. And you will notice that the teacher-centered approach and the student-centered approach are connected by double-headed arrows. So the teacher decides on the aims and objectives, and these help to achieve the learning outcomes of the students. And whether or not the students achieve the learning outcomes will provide feedback to the teacher, who may have to adjust the aims and objectives, or may have to change the method of teaching or assessment. Now, why has learning outcomes concept become international? It all started in Europe with what is called the Bologna process. Way back in 1999, 29 countries came together, and they said, in all of the universities in these countries, we will describe all of our courses, every one of them, in terms of learning outcomes. We will use the common language of learning outcomes. The reason for this was because up to 1999, every university was different. Some used aims, some used objectives, some used competences, and some used learning outcomes. And when I was training to be a teacher in this university, we learned about learning outcomes in our training. But every other faculty never used learning outcomes. Learning outcomes only came to this university in 2006. They were nothing new to us who had done our degree in education. But now everybody uses learning outcomes throughout the world. Now, so some people think that it's just a European Union initiative, but in fact non-European Union countries have also used them. If this started in the European Union, why have I been to Costa Rica and Peru and the Philippines and United Arab Emirates and countries all over the world? The reason is very simple. Because learning outcomes have become the common language for education, universities all over the world look at the importance of international mobility and recognition for their students. They want their students who come with a degree in engineering from El Salvador or Guatemala or wherever to be able to be recognized to work in another country. And also, it makes it very easy to have students doing some of their degree here in Cork and some of their degree in a Central American university, because they have achieved the same learning outcomes. So the whole idea of the Bologna process was to pick a language of learning outcomes that everybody understood. There were hundreds of definitions of this word competence. Nobody will agree on what the word competence means. It is a very vague term, but learning outcomes are crystal clear. There are no rules for writing competences, but there are very specific rules for writing learning outcomes. So that is why in every university, in every country, in all of the 48 countries, every subject must be written in terms of learning outcomes. And this has one of the 10 what are called action lines, easily readable and comparable degrees. And also, of course, it all comes from quality assurance. Because if the degree is not clearly described, how can you assess what the students are supposed to achieve if you're dealing with vague concepts like competences, for example? Okay, so what do we mean by teaching within a learning outcome? When they were designing a learning outcomes framework in Europe, and remember, all of this process of learning outcomes started in Europe, and it has been extremely successful. And that's why the European Commission are very supportive of other countries. And when the ministers for education met to discuss progress being made, they told the professors in the university, it is important that you make progress in converting your description of courses to learning outcomes. And right up through the early 2000s, this emphasis came into being. This university started training its professors in 2006. I joined the university here in 1998. I had been working as a secondary school teacher of chemistry and physics and mathematics. And I got the job here training science teachers. And I did my PhD in 2004. So when the president of the university set up a team, he asked me if I would do the training for our professors in the area of learning outcomes. And the vice president at the time was a Professor Anya Hyland, and she had a brilliant idea. She said, we will train the professors during lunchtime. We will invite them to come to us, and we will give them free lunch. free cup of coffee, free tea, and eat their sandwiches. And while the professors were eating their sandwiches, we were teaching them how to write learning outcomes for modules and programs, and how to design new programs within a learning outcomes framework. So from 2006 till about 2010, we trained the professors here. And great progress has been made, because since that time, every course, in every subject, in every university, has been written in terms of learning outcomes. Some professors do a very good job at it, others not so good. In all my experience of giving training courses in writing learning outcomes, the best people for writing learning outcomes are engineers. I'm not saying that because you are engineers. I have said it wherever I go. Engineers are good logical thinkers. They are good at constructing programs and seeing how the learning outcomes tie into each other and how they're all linked. So great progress has been made. I'll only refer briefly to some of these slides, but I've included them. But what's important is that everybody understands the definition of learning outcomes. A statement of what a student should know, understand, and be able to do at the end of a learning experience. Now, a lot of research has been done here in Europe on the assessment of higher education. This was done as recently as 2012. So you're coming at a good time, because we now know a lot more than we did if you were here 10 years ago. And one of the things they found was that many countries are aligning their systems to be compatible with the Bologna process. In other words, country after country are writing their courses in terms of a learning outcomes framework. And the second thing that they noticed is that now our professors are better trained in teaching and learning. You see, we have a problem here in Ireland. If you want to teach in an elementary school, you must be a qualified teacher. If you want to teach in a secondary school, you must be a qualified teacher. But anyone can teach at university. Anyone. You just need masters or PhD, you get the job, off you go. And sometimes we do not give any training to our professors. So, what learning outcomes was like, it was like a catalyst. When we brought these professors together for the free lunch seminars, some of them said, we are giving up a lot of our time and we are finding this interesting. Could we have more of them, and could we get credit for them? Could we get a diploma or certificate in teaching and learning in higher education? And that's exactly what we did, and I'll explain about that in a moment. So what are learning outcomes helping us to do? They are not asking us to change our old ways necessarily. What they are saying is the learning outcomes are like looking down the microscope, and we turn the knob because our teaching and learning is fuzzy. It is not very clear. And then we turn the knob and suddenly the picture becomes clear. That is what learning outcomes are doing. It's giving us a clear picture of teaching, learning and assessment. And it's helping us to become better teachers. When I started giving the training courses, I would bring in papers from the literature on education. But my fellow professors said, Declan, we do not have time to read all these papers. Can you write something simple for us? So I sat down one summer and I wrote this book, Writing and Using Learning Outcomes, a Practical Guide. So everything that the professors needed to write their courses within a learning outcomes framework, I put in this book. It was written just for the professors in my university. But then professors in other universities heard about it and started looking for the book. And then in other countries, they heard about it and looked for permission to translate it. And of course, we gave away that permission. No problem at all, because we were not seeking to make money. And in fact, one of the first translations was in Espanol. And this was done by the government in Chile. They translated it and gave it out to all the professors in the university. Now, if you want to do some reading about it, it is available free I put it on the university system because I did not have time to be answering emails or sending electronic versions. So you can download the English version of the book online without any difficulty at all. There are also some papers. This is our former Professor of Education, Anya Hyland, and this is Norma Ryan, who was head of the Quality Assurance Agency here in the university. And this article is a summary of what is in the book, but we had to leave out lots of examples. But you will find that on the internet. And arising out of our work, we set up CERTIN, the Centre for the Integration of Research, Teaching and Learning, and my colleague and good friend, Dr. Marion McCarthy, will be speaking to you this afternoon.
Wow.
No, Marion speaks very, very fast. Very, very fast. So you will have to say to Marion, Marion, please slow down. Even I find it hard to understand Marion. She's so fast. But do not be afraid, she will not mind at all. Okay? Right, so we have that. We also have, and I'm just going to mention this, in all the courses that you would have come across, you would have come across the here in Ireland, you would have come across the ECTS system, the European Credit Transfer System. Now, so the learning outcomes are the common language for education. And when the students achieve the learning outcomes, they get ECTS credits. So the credits are the common currency. It's like money in the bank for the students. So the ECTS system is the common currency. And there is an ECTS user's guide on it, but you needn't worry too much about that. But the ECTS and learning outcomes go hand in hand for that reason. And in Ireland, one ECTS credit is worth between 25 and 30 hours of student workload. So you might be able to relate that to your own system back in El Salvador and back in Guatemala. So the Bologna process has been the biggest and greatest change that we have ever experienced in the history of university education in Europe. The biggest change, because it affected every single university in all of these 48 countries. And arising from the Bologna process, we now set up various qualification frameworks, for example, national qualification frameworks. Now, I'll go through the remaining slides very quickly because I want to get on to the writing of learning outcomes. And so there has been continuous pressure going on to 2012 to get all of the universities and all of the countries up to speed. And we have this Bologna framework where we have 3 cycles: bachelor's, master's, and PhD. And in our national qualifications framework, we have what they call generic descriptors. Now, generic descriptors are very broad statements which help us to write program learning outcomes. I will give you examples of those later on. And we also have a number of credits associated with each year. You probably are aware that a student workload is made up of 60 ECTS credits per year. And the Dublin descriptors are the descriptors for every one of the cycles. They're called Dublin descriptors because the Ministers for Education met in Dublin and agreed on these descriptors. Now, what are the descriptors? What the Learning Outcomes Framework is saying is that every university which is part of the 48 Bologna countries, if they're offering a bachelor's degree, They must have knowledge and understanding, applying knowledge and understanding. They must have the ability, the students must have the ability to gather and interpret data. It must have communication skills, and it must serve as a foundation. So these are the generic descriptors for every degree that is written within a learning outcomes framework. What about a master's degree? In all of these countries, in the Bologna process, the master's degree must have between 60 and 120 of these ECTS credits. And what must they have? Every master's graduate must be able to demonstrate knowledge and understanding, apply knowledge and understanding, integrate knowledge, communicate conclusions, and have learning skills that will serve as a foundation for PhD. So these are the generic descriptors. And finally then, the PhD. They didn't specify any particular number of credits for a PhD, none at all. But you can see the emphasis there is all on research and analysis and evaluation and synthesis. And again, communication is so important in all of these generic descriptors. So in Europe, Bologna specifies a bachelor's degree can be 3 or 4, a master's degree 1 or 2, and a doctoral degree full-time is 3 years. But that tends to be a bit higher than on the ground, as it were. So we now have 48 countries who have all signed the Bologna Agreement. And of these 48 countries, there has been great progress made in designing them, in putting the Bologna process, as it were, into practice. And then what's involved on the ground to show that we teach within a learning outcomes framework? Well, every country has to have its national qualifications framework. That is, every country must have a structure onto which every degree can be mapped. Every country had to introduce learning outcomes and describe modules and programs. And that meant the professors getting the paperwork right and making sure that a learning outcomes framework was used in their everyday teaching. And also, everything had to be expressed in terms of credits, and then evidence in terms of the assessment that the learning outcomes had been achieved. And finally then, the linking up of the 3 things. The learning outcomes, like the 3 corners of a triangle. The learning outcomes, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment. Getting all of those aligned or coordinated with each other. And in designing any degree, that is very important. You know, I work as external examiner for a number of degrees, and one of them is over in London, in UK. And when I go as external examiner, the first thing I look for are what are the learning outcomes for the program, what are the module learning outcomes, and show me how you have lined them up, how they are aligned or coordinated. And after coffee, we will be having a look at this coordination. So what were the learning outcomes that I made for this presentation? Well, hopefully now you can distinguish between the terms aims, objectives, and learning outcomes. Hopefully you will see the difference between student-centered learning and teacher-centered learning. Teacher-centered learning aims and objectives, and student-centered learning, learning outcomes. Hopefully you can see that learning outcomes are part of a much bigger picture that's taking place as we speak in 48 countries around the world. And hopefully you will appreciate that there is a fair amount of work, but very straightforward amount of work, in designing bachelor's and master's programs within a learning outcomes framework. So I will stop there, and I think we're doing well in time. So I'm happy to answer any questions before you go for a break, if you wish, or if you need the questions until later. Does anybody have any questions on learning outcomes?
Who creates learning outcomes? Is it the person that's going to teach? Or
yes, the professor writes the learning outcomes. So you are going to give a short course on something. And the first thing you do is, when the students finish this course, what will they be able to do? So you write down, calculate, design, or whatever.
There's already some documentation for that.
There is.
There's the responsibility to check to see if it's data.
If it's correct.
If
If it's correct and lined up. There is indeed. And in my second talk, I'll be showing you how to do that documentation. You know, but it's very important that the professor has a clear indication in his or her mind as to what the student should be able to do. And it is also very important that when you set the examination paper, that the exam questions examine the learning outcomes, that you have achieved the learning outcomes. There is no point in writing learning outcomes if they're just going to be theory and if they're not reflected in the exam. And very often, one of the things that I used to do with the professors is do a workshop. And I say to the professors, bring in the paper that you gave your students last June. And they bring in the exam paper, and we would map those then onto the learning outcomes. And sometimes they might say, oh, I'm not examining this learning outcome at all on distinguishing, because there's no question. So, and we will have a closer look at that in the second talk. Now, are there any other questions? It's very interesting in assessment. When I leave my house every morning, I do not come to the university. I go out to the local schools where my students are teaching. Good morning. I am here to supervise your lesson. My students are always very happy when they see me. Now, why do I have to visit my students? Because one of the learning outcomes in my module is that the students should be able to manage young children. They must have good classroom management skills. And the only way that I can assess that learning outcome is to visit them in the classroom. There'd be no point by giving them an exam paper, for example. So we have to match the assessment to the learning outcome. That is really important to do that link. But we will discuss that after we take a break here.